Hello and welcome to this session on forklift truck safety. I want to focus specifically on the pre-use checks, but prior to doing that, need to get into the understanding and the background to forklift trucks, the risks associated with them, the legislation and codes of practice and standards that are out there for forklift truck drivers, and how the pre-use checks have evolved into being something as known as industry practice and therefore has a special legal standing and requirement. So first of all, the introduction, forklifts are very, very useful for moving raw materials around, and for me it reduces the risk of manual handling activities. But when you do bring in forklift trucks, there is the opportunity for more accidents to take place. And in accordance with the figures, 25 to 30% of all transport related accidents are from the use of lift trucks, whether it's bad practice or whether it's actually distractions or other means. It leads to incidents that have happened that could have been avoided in many cases. Quite often it's drivers themselves and picking up some bad habits. So again, the aspect around making sure that the forklift truck is good, fit for purpose and remains fit for purpose, part of it is to do the pre-use checks before you go out with your vehicle. So the main cause of accidents resulted from lack of operator training and lack of awareness, lack of co-worker awareness. So the people working around the forklift trucks in the areas not knowing that certain aspects of the activities around the forklift truck can be quite risky. Poor maintenance, hence the need for doing these checks, and also no safe systems of work regarding the use of the forklift trucks. A couple of items I've taken from recent press clippings showing that companies have ended in court as a result of the forklift truck failures. So this one is a crash that took place in Wigan on site with a refuse skip, and it resulted in the company being prosecuted, fined £20,000 and then £4,000 for the costs that were incurred as well. The focus there being sections 2, the general duties of the Health and Safety at Work Act. Section 3 is extending that out to others that are affected by the work, so contractors, visitors and the likes of. And that's where they became, should we say, thankfully, it could have been a lot worse in some respects, but thankfully it was just a bad accident. But it comes down to bad practices. And the company failed to implement a safe system of work. So that's one of the key areas around section 2 of the Act itself. The inspector says the risk of injury from this unsafe working practice was foreseeable. Therefore, a risk assessment should have identified this and made sure those practices were avoided. Profile themselves should have put in place a number of safety measures, including appropriate segregation of vehicles and pedestrians. That's a standard requirement where possible. A safe system of work expected for, in this case, emptying the bins, and those in control of work also have the responsibility to provide the necessary information, instruction, and training to their workers in order to carry out the work safely. Again, that's a requirement of section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. The second incident here, a company that manufactures metal pressings. In this case, there was a serious injury, a brain injury from the activity around the forklift truck. So the worker needed to be placed in an induced coma as a result of being struck by the forklift truck. The investigation identified that there was inadequate control of workplace transport risks. So again, comes under the generality of section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, but they've then drilled it down even further because of the links to the workplace health, safety and welfare regulations to make sure the transport is adequately managed whilst in the workplace, and a much higher fine here in this case because of the severity of the injury. So being struck by a forklift truck is common in the workplace. So again, can turn into some really nasty accidents. And again, the inspector at the bottom there said failure to ensure that the workplace transport is managed safely was one of the key issues here in terms of not meeting the health and safety duties. So moving on to the risks associated with trucks, and obviously it's a big truck. It could be 2, 3, 4, 5 tons in weight and growing. So there's a lot there, and it's a moving vehicle on wheels. So it has the ability to do damage. The most common is being struck by the lift truck. The lift truck rolling over, so being destabilized and falling to the side, usually going across a gradient is the cause in that respect, or lifting a load at height and then moving around with it, so the central gravity changes. Driver being struck by falling items, so the items that are being lifted at height perhaps aren't stable, or you go over rough ground, and by doing so it bounces a little bit and destabilizes the load that's being carried. Passengers falling out, quite rare this one, and there's always the debate as to whether people who are driving forklift trucks should be wearing seatbelts. I'll come back to that later, but nevertheless, it is designed for just one person to be using the vehicle, and a few occasions the passengers that are falling out literally should not be passengers. They shouldn't be on the vehicle at all. Unauthorized startup, so quite often now, as we've got at Flamco, there is a key code system that can be put in, as well as a key to turn it on. The idea behind that is that individuals are supposed to have their own PIN number, and then you can track who the driver is, and ultimately the driver is someone who's been trained and authorized to use the vehicle. But some people think, well, I can drive a car, so it should be as easy as that. If I've got my driving license, I can jump into a forklift truck and it should be okay, but it's not. And there should be a list of people who've been trained. They should be then given the opportunity. So someone then has to say, as a line manager, you are now authorized to use this forklift truck. So here at Flamco, it will be perhaps Declan would hold that list, and it would stipulate who is allowed to use what truck, because they've had the forklift truck license training, but over and above that, they've had truck specific training on doing the job and also using that particular truck. So there's that as well. Inadequate braking, common problem whereby maybe the pipes are leaking on the braking system, or there's just wear and tear on the braking, or inadequate braking because they're driving too fast and don't anticipate a turn, or other obstacles might be in the way. And then restricted driver visibility, which is a common problem because you're lifting a load and you might be lifting the load at height and it's in the sight or vision areas, and therefore you should always be looking in the direction of travel. Some of the more modern trucks nowadays have the added warning systems in, so the lights, the blue light that shows that you're reversing. But the important thing is that when your view is restricted, you should be always looking in the direction of travel. So if you can't see forward, you should be reversing. Whilst reversing, you should be looking in the direction of travel, i.e. behind you. Even though there are mirrors, that's okay as a backup, and some of these nice new forklift trucks even have camera systems in place, but it doesn't take away the need to be looking in the direction of travel. The legislation behind it is there's quite a few pieces of legislation around the use of lift trucks. DSEA, dangerous substances, explosive atmospheres, if it's LPG fueled, so there's a chance there from an explosion from the fuel. The Health and Safety at Work Act is important in terms of its general duties. Look after yourself, look after others, making sure that the safe systems of work are considered and risks are managed. The Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations focus specifically on any risk, and then to conduct a risk assessment to identify the hazards, but more importantly, the control measures that need to be in place to manage the risk at an acceptable low level. The LOLA regs, lifting operation, lifting equipment regs, well, lift trucks are lifting equipment. So by the definition of it, it falls under this piece of legislation. Within that, there's a guidance document, Industrial G, so IND G 462, and that's titled Lift Truck Training, Advice for Employers, and it explains to the Flamco management team here, as well as other employers, how to train people up to not only get the basic license, but also to then have job training on how to use the lift truck, and also truck specific training, so you know the differences. And what I mean by that is you may have gone off to Warrington, for instance, to have your license done there, and having done that, perhaps you did an electric truck, and then you come into site here and then using gas truck. So you need to be shown the differences on it. Similarly, as much as you might have a chicane set up and perhaps a warehouse where you can deliver load onto and take it off of the racking systems, you still need job specific training that will then show you, for example, how to load or unload off a trailer, how to drive into the back of a trailer, and to know that the base weight of the trailer itself can withstand the weight of a 2, 3 or 4 ton truck driving into the back of it, and so on and so forth. And some just can't, and hence the need for making sure that people are fully aware of the do's and don'ts. So the IND G 462 covers some of those aspects. Similar to LOLA regulations, the pure regulations, so the provision use of work equipment regs, looks at any form of workplace equipment and how it's used so that it actually enhances safety. So it uses phrases like equipment should be fit for purpose, and then it must be inspected, monitored, regularly checked and maintained so that it remains fit for purpose. And so there's quite a lot of involvement in that. And again, just like LOLA, Pure also has the approved code of practice, which is on the bottom right hand side there in the picture, showing safe use of work equipment. So it's very, very detailed and works hand in hand with the LOLA regs. And then you've got RTITB standard that have written the rider operated lift truck operator training approved code of practice. Now, approved codes of practice have a specific place in legislation, and if ever in court, it'd be the standard that's looked to show that it matches the industry standard or expectations. So as RTITB have written this is kind of the Bible for all forklift truck drivers to use and to follow. And then you've got the supporting industrial guidance note 457, which is about how we use safely a lift truck. But the emphasis there is on the operator. So where you've had the advice earlier for the employer, you now have the specifics for the operator in terms of their duties, their role, the amount of training they should have received, the safe systems, but more importantly, the good habits and avoiding the bad habits of driving lift trucks. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the aspects of the law. Section 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 of the Health and Safety at Work Act are focused on duties, and they're very general. So the employer's duties come under 2 and 3, and then you've got the specifics for employees under 7 and 8. So there's a lot that the employer has to do on health and safety side under 2 and 3, but then individuals themselves, employees within the workplace, have to look after themselves, look after others that might be affected by what they do, cooperate with their employer in the interests of health and safety. And then Section 8 is about don't recklessly or intentionally interfere with anything provided in the interests of health and safety. So if a machine has a guard in it, don't take the guard off. Those kind of things. In the aspect of forklift trucks, it's follow the rules in which you've been trained in a very general, open way. But we need the Act to define what's in place, and then we need the supporting regulations to go and give us more specifics. The management regulations, again, emphasis on the employers to do risk assessments, have management systems in place to oversee, control, monitor and review health and safety. Competent person must be appointed like myself to give the appropriate advice. Emergency procedures and control measures need to be in place when things go wrong or there is a crisis on site. And then also providing the information, instruction, training and supervision that's expected under the Act to make sure that all health and safety matters are adhered to. And then there's the aspect around some parts of training that are needed to make sure that the job is done properly, including casuals or temporary employment. So employees side of it, there's an extension of the general duties under the Act, but here it's about, if we think of the forklift truck driver being an employee, but cooperating with their employer. So if we've written a safe system of work on how to use the forklift truck, then follow that. But the extension here and the specifics of it is to let us know when things aren't right. So if the employer or Flamco are expected to provide a decent forklift truck, let us know when something's not right with it. And that's the key purpose of doing the daily checks or the pre-operation checks that should be in place, so that you don't drive off on a forklift truck that is in fact unsafe or not fit for purpose. And the idea being that it's then the employer's duty to do something about it, to get it back on the road safely and in a timely manner. But it comes back to report it. Let us know, particularly identify some of those defects and tell us in some cases whether people are not driving as they should do or as safely as they should do, where they're putting others at risk because bad habits have come into place. And that happens on a lot of companies that I've given advice to. I've recently been, sorry, not recently, but I've previously been a forklift truck instructor. So I've got a lot of information that and experience in those areas, and I've seen bad habits and done observations where people are focused too much on the load when they're reversing backwards. And for me, that's, again, you should always be looking in the direction of travel. And the other thing is act in the manner in which you've been instructed. So there it says follow health and safety instructions. So once you've been given the training, the information, the instruction on how to do something, in this case drive a forklift truck, then it's your duty to then follow those rules. Under the pure regs, there's an extension there on the general duty to train people. So regulation 9 puts a lot of emphasis on the need for adequate training. And as I mentioned before, there's 3 areas of training that need to be done, not just the license, but the job specific and the forklift specific training as well. Users of any equipment must be trained in all aspects of the job. So that's where that job specific comes. And then use of lift trucks must be restricted to trained personnel only. So you can't just turn around and say, oh, John's not available today, I'll get Tom in and he's not been trained on it, but he'll be okay. You can't have that approach. You've got to make sure that all people involved in it are fully aware of the risks. Now, regulation 26 focuses more on FOPs and ROPs, so fall over protection systems and rollover protection systems. So we're anticipating that if something does go wrong, maybe something either falls onto you as the driver whilst you're driving the forklift truck, or the forklift truck rolls over or falls over. If that's the case, what do we have as a means of protection? So the rollover protection devices are there to, the cage around the operation area is there to help prevent and reduce those risks. Now, within the regulations, they do have a section on it about the use of seat belts, and it is based on risk assessment. Now, many companies say it's mandatory, you must wear a seat belt if a seat belt is provided. And the idea of that, I guess, has been taken from what we use in cars and vehicles on the road. However, it's quite different. So the risk-based approach is to say, if I'm on and off and on and off and on and off the truck, you know, several times in the hour, then and I'm traveling around at a level plane that has no destabilizing risks, that it means I'm picking a pallet up and dropping it off somewhere else, and others are not at risk, So if we do a risk assessment, it identifies that all forklift truck activities are low risk, then it is justified to then say to people, you don't need to wear a seatbelt. However, if you're traveling long distances, if you're on the forklift truck for a long period of time whilst operating it, if you're going up and down terrain, rough terrain, gradients and likes of, and you never have to get off the truck, or you're on there for hours before having to get off, then the risk then determines that there is a need to wear the seatbelt. Off the top of my head, I can't say whether Flamco would automatically fall into that or not, but what I will do after this is conduct a review of the risk assessments and then see whether collectively as a group we agree that we should or should not be wearing seatbelts. Protection about other people. So this comes back to the workplace regulations as well as the inference in the pure regs to make sure that they're safe. So it must be provided to the people who are pedestrians in the area to know about the risks associated with forklift trucks. So it's not a complete surprise to them when suddenly a forklift truck is driving past them or close to them. And the emphasis is always about putting engineering controls in place, typically barriers that will segregate the pedestrians from the vehicles. So that's your top of your hierarchy, and you should always try and aim for that. But if you can't justify that, and there has to be crossing points where pedestrians are going across, the reminder there is that the pedestrian always has right of way, and therefore the forklift truck should give way to the pedestrian until they're not a risk as such. So there's those aspects again around reminding drivers of best practice and what should be in place and priorities. Now, competent person, in this case myself, must give appropriate advice to the supervisors and managers also about equipment in general. In this case, we're talking about forklift trucks. So quite often we find that a good forklift truck driver can be doing a good job, but the supervisor or line manager in the area has no clue at all as to whether it's good, bad or indifferent. If over the years bad habits start to crawl in, again, the manager, supervisor might not see these or be aware of them and not know. Therefore, here it says that your line managers, supervisors or otherwise, also need to know about the health and safety aspects of using forklift trucks. So then they can say that is or is not acceptable. So that's a duty of the employers under PURE. The specifics under LOLA is a lot more. So it comes down to making sure that the forklift truck, the piece of equipment that's being provided to lift other pieces of equipment and move things around, is done in a very safe manner. And there's a lot riding on that. First of all, they have to plan their lifting operations. And that has to be looked at by a LOLA competent person who knows the risks and the expected control measures. So again, I can be in there to give advice on that, but the plan has to be agreed by a manager who will then say, this is the way that we're going to do our lifting operations. This is the way we're going to use our trucks. And these are the do's and don'ts. For a while, those newish lifting operations need a period of bedding in. So again, the competently supervised person needs to oversee these things. Typically, a supervisor or line manager takes that role. And again, going back to the idea of saying before about the line manager needing to know about forklift truck activities and what is deemed to be safe. So good supervision is required to make sure that good habits are enhanced, bad habits are avoided. Lifting operations must be carried out safely. So again, coming back to the supervision and coming back to the plan, if you plan to do something and then people are supervising, then it should be automatically that it's all done safely. However, opportunity to review, discuss it, think about safer ways in which lifting can take place. The plate that's on the bottom right there, but a capacity plate is needed on all forklift trucks. And the idea behind that is not so that we know what the lift truck is capable of lifting, but also the calculations that the driver has to do quite often in their head to see whether the truck in its various setups and the height of the forks themselves when they're picking off and placing, from a variety of circumstances, as to whether the capacity, the capability of the truck, it's not changing the center of gravity and also destabilizing the truck itself. So you need the plate available that will tell you the variations on the theme as to the positioning, the heights of the forks, and where the length or a very lengthy load that's been lifted, and the center of gravity to that, to the center of gravity of the forklift truck, as to whether when they combine them together, whether it remains within the capacity of the truck itself. So the calculations that are required for lifting loads. The lift truck must be adequately inspected and thoroughly examined with records retained. So every year, typically insurance companies, I'm working with HSB Engineering at the moment, doing some training with them, and they were saying that the thorough examinations they do identify quite a few issues. Cracks on forks are quite often the issues. Leaks on the hydraulics that have been ignored. The brakes themselves, and the lack of servicing of the brakes. So this thorough examination is very much like an MOT. It's annually done and it's imposed by your insurance company, but it's written into the LOLA regulations. And it comes back to the idea of the employer has to provide equipment that's fit for purpose, but then they also have to make sure that it remains fit for purpose. So the outsider independently coming in to do a thorough examination helps to keep it on track annually. Over and above that, though, we still need drivers to report when things are not quite right, or they're feeling or seeing differences with the movement of the forklift truck, or the driving of it, or the hydraulics are not working as effectively as they should do. So the more we get to know about what the problems are, the more maintenance that should be in place to make sure that it remains fit for purpose. If you have tyres that are inflated, then tyre pressures must be clearly marked and also checked on a daily basis. There aren't that many forklift trucks nowadays that are inflated tyres. The unfortunate thing is that the solid tyres, with them being solid, means that the drivers tend to feel the vibration coming through on the bumps, much more so, because I don't know any forklift truck that's fantastic with its absorption, shock absorbers, for reducing risks associated with that. But nevertheless, that's another requirement written into law as well. The other guidance that's readily available and training that you should have received when you had your license is around the safety for the forklift truck driver and others in the area. So thinking about, excuse me, how the job is done and the impact it has on others whilst you are doing your job. So by law, the forklift truck operator must make sure that lift truck you drive is maintained and used so that it is unlikely to cause a danger to anyone. If specific items are checked daily, it will help to identify obvious vehicle defects. When conducting pre-checks, it's important for the operator to follow a routine so that nothing is overlooked. When conducting the checks, caution should be taken to look out for other vehicles. People being hit or run over by forklifts is one of the main causes of workplace death. Injuries caused by forklift trucks are generally very serious because of the size and weight of the machines, and each operator must be satisfied that their forklift truck that they are driving and operating is free from defects. So, as I was saying before, because this is considered to be industry standard, there's an expectation on the operator to do the pre-use checks. Any defects should be recorded and reported to the employer or responsible person so that appropriate action can be taken. Now, the responsible person could be a chief engineer on a site that's overseeing all engineering activities, and they may say, well, it's my responsibility to make sure that all equipment remains fit for purpose, and I organise the maintenance. In this case, it would be Declan as the, I should say, from the operational side and the production side, it would be his responsibility, because that piece of equipment is brought into the warehouse and the production area for use as a piece of work equipment. So forklift trucks standards there. So reports and defects must be forwarded to Declan. Any safety critical defects must be rectified before the forklift truck is used. So what we're saying there is, if it's serious, braking, the hydraulics are affected, there's something wrong with the steering, then those kind of issues are going to seriously impact on the safety of the movement of the forklift truck and the use of it. So it means that you can't use the forklift truck, it's not safe to use. So you make that decision, you report it to your manager, and then or Declan, and as a result of that, the forklift truck is taken out of commission until a maintenance engineer can come to site and rectify that problem. What we don't want to happen is that people carry on regardless. They ignore the fact that it's not as good as it should be, and they take the risk. That must be avoided. So the means we use to try and identify these potential maintenance related issues and the wear and tear on the vehicle itself is known as the pre-use safety checks. Ultimately, the vehicle must be fit for purpose and safe to use. This inspection provides the opportunity to check and then report any defects. Plan your route around the truck and check in a logical sequence. It helps you then to make sure that you don't miss anything. Have a copy of the daily pre-use or visual and practical inspection sheet to help structure the inspection. So as you can see from the picture of the guy at the bottom there, that checklist means you can go through each one systematically and tick it off as you go through. My worry is always that people take it for granted, that it's just a tick box exercise, and what they'll do is, regardless of doing the checks, because it's going to take 5 to 10 minutes to do those checks, they don't take it seriously and they just tick it off and sign at the bottom and pass it on because they can't be bothered. It is the law to conduct the pre-use check, and therefore it's the duty of the driver to conduct that pre-use check. Be prepared to report any defects to your line manager or the responsible person, and to make sure that operators do not use the truck if you deem it to be unsafe. So in the LOLA, lifting operations, lifting equipment regulations, it makes reference to, as it said, the pre-use safety checks in L117, the approved code of practice for forklift truck operated trucks. So there's a link there. With this being available, it's considered to be the industry standard. And if it went to court as a result of an accident, they would immediately say, were the pre-use checks done on a regular basis? And if there were problems associated with the forklift truck, were they reported? And then was anything serious taken out of action? So a serious safety issue found on the forklift truck was not acceptable to drive, and can it be seen that you follow those procedures? If those are not deemed to be followed, then the company can be prosecuted, and the individual themselves, the employee or the driver, operator of the forklift truck, can also be prosecuted for it. And this is an area that people don't tend to fully understand or appreciate. It is and can be directed specifically at the operator if it's deemed to be an unsafe driving practice to cause a serious accident. Okay, so part of your defense is to make sure that you do regular pre-use safety checks, so that if there is anything deemed wrong with the forklift truck, then it doesn't result in an accident because it wasn't fit for purpose and you've reported it and not used it. So that's, as much as people say, well, it's the law, it kind of is inferred within the law that it must be done. So at the beginning, as it's written in the forklift truck guidance document, or in this case, the code of practice, at the beginning of each shift, the operator should check the lift truck in accordance with the vehicle handbook and the documents associated with it. So the manufacturer provides information about every truck, and that manual dictates what should be checked on the daily inspections. They should report to the supervisor any defects which might affect its safe operation to ensure they are put right. Okay, so it's written in there that if you identify any problems whilst doing the inspection, then you make the judgment as to whether it can be safely used. And if the answer is no, it can't safely be used, then it's got to be taken out of commission and others should be notified not to use that truck. The typical list that's advised within the L117 ACOP states damage to tyres, tyre pressures on pneumatic tyres, the condition of wheels, the tightness and security of wheel nuts, a function test on the parking brakes, service brakes and steering gear to ensure they work efficiently, fluid levels, for example, check fuel, water, engine and transmission oils, batteries to make sure they're adequately charged and leak free, a functional test on systems for lifting, tilting and manipulation, including attachments to ensure they work properly, a visual inspection of the hydraulic system, looking for leaks and any problems with the hydraulics, the condition and security of the overhead guard, so for fall protection and roll protection, the forks for cracks, particularly on the heels, and mounting hooks, bent or damaged fork tips, and missing or damaged fork position locks. So again, there's quite a detail around looking at the forks, because quite often the forks themselves are damaged during the movement of picking and placing loads. The chains for secure anchor pins, fixing bolts, damaged or elongated links and lubrication, any audible warning signals, horns in particular, the lights that are part of the warning system on the lit truck, and then mirrors and in some cases cameras, any other visibility aids that are fitted. So that's the typical advice expected. The picture we've got on the right hand side there shows you some of the checks that are done as it's taken out of a maintenance log. So just to blow that up a bit further, you can see there now the typical things should be looked at. Now, on the left-hand side with the wording here, always follow the pre-instructions in the manufacturer's manual and do not use the forklift if any of the following conditions exist. So, the mast has broken or cracked weld points. Roller tracks are not greased or the chains are not free to travel. Forks are unequally spaced or cracks exist along the blade or at the heels. Hydraulic fluid levels are low. Hydraulic lines and fittings have excessive wear or are crimped. Fluid is leaking from the lift or the tilt cylinders. The hardware on the cylinder is loose. The tyres are excessively worn or split or have missing tyre material. The tyre wheels are damaged, cracked or loose wheel nuts. The batteries have cracks or holes, uncapped cells, frayed cables, broken cable insulation, loose connection or clogged vent caps. So there's quite a lot to look for, but that's typically what we consider unsafe to use. And therefore, if you identify these, perhaps some of them, like putting grease on the roller tracks, you could do safely and then would say, I've done that, I've put the grease on and now I've tried the operation of the roller tracks and they seem to be working fine now. But the idea is don't carry on using the truck while it's dry and without the grease, because that will increase the wear and tear to the roller tracks. So make that decision on whether you deem it to be unsafe. If it is unsafe, take the truck out of commission and inform Declan, and so that he can arrange for the maintenance to be put in place. So just a few pointers without going into too much detail, but about things that we generally find. But there's a picture on the bottom left of an examiner, an independent examiner, looking at the forklift's truck. And in this case, he's got the fork and he's looking for the heel, where there may be crack or damage. But here you've got advice on the functionality of the lift truck itself. So those little GIFs that are moving up and down there, just showing about the additional bits and pieces that could be on the forks and the hydraulics. Check for wear, damage, distortion and cracks. Check that the end stop bolts are engaged and secure, and check functional movement of the forks on the mast. In practice, cracks may not be obvious due to mud, rust, paint, metal and scars. So if you can't see them, we don't expect you to take paint off or anything like that. But if you suspect that there's some small crack that may be bigger than what it is below paint surface, then report it and let the responsible person, Declan, make a decision as to whether it's safe to use. Checking the batteries and the hydraulics. We're looking at the hydraulic system and how it functions. So there should be within the manufacturer's information an explanation of that, maybe a flow diagram that shows the various parts and how it works. So you can get to know that over a period of time, and that'll help you that when you use the handles on the hydraulics, that they should quickly and actively move the forks up and down. So you'll be able to look for damage or fluid leaks. You'll be able to see splits in hoses, and you'll be able to look for leaks around the fittings. And when you operate the hydraulics themselves, sometimes you can hear noises that weren't the same as previously, and that might identify a leak itself. The batteries, well, there's a little bit more in that because it depends how much of the battery there is in terms of if it's electric in particular. And some of the electrolyte levels that are being used within the battery at the required level, doing the checks on that takes a little bit more time. The power cables, are they intact? Are they secure? Are they connected as they should be? Just to make sure that it's not going to cause damage, but also unnecessary sparking because there's maybe a short from an exposed cable. And from that, no exposed wires should be evident because there's an increased risk of sparking and an ignition source causing a fire. And the brackets themselves being secure and the battery adequately charged. Now, within a few companies, what we find is that if they're on a 24/7 system, or they have an early shift, a mid shift, and then a late shift that are going through the night, you have to question as to whether the charging of forklift trucks can be adequately put in place. And some companies go for another forklift truck or two to make sure there's always adequate provision, so that whilst one forklift truck or two are on charge, the others can be in operation. But it's important that there is that level of charging that takes place, because you don't want to be in the middle of the warehouse or production and then suddenly find out you've no power. So again, make sure that those checks are done and that charging is adequate to give you the operation required. So the inspection check itself is usually a piece of paper with a list of things that you go down, and they can tick off. You're saying, when you are hitting that tick and putting it in place, you're saying, I've looked at this and I agree it to be safe. And that judgment is your own, and then you're going to sign it off. And some people would worry that if their name's against it, then they themselves can be blamed. Well, you're authorized to use a vehicle that's quite dangerous. Therefore, it can't be the responsible person, Declan's, fault if something happens whilst the driver is driving, particularly if it's unsafe practice. But this is your defence as much as it is, so your protection and defence as much as it can be used against you. So I tend to stress to people, it's a requirement by law, therefore follow the rules and apply them as best. And it's important that you consider that if nothing is found to be unsafe, then it's a good piece of kit and it should be used in the workplace. However, if it is seen to be damaged or in need of repair, give it the opportunity by filling in the check sheet and then passing it on to Declan to do something about it. Now, RTIDB, I've got this nice advice sheet So I thought I'd put that in there to give you some hints and tips on the various things that should be looked at and checked for during your inspection. This poster is available. I've got 2 of them on site, so we'll put it near where you would typically do the pre-use checks. Probably going to put it up on the warehouse next to the charging point, because I think once you've taken the charger off, that's probably the area you're going to use for doing your pre-use checks. There's also a couple of smaller versions of this available where it's a pocket-held advice note. So I'll give a few of those out to forklift truck operators as well as a reminder.
Balance forklift pre-use checks. Truck we're using is a Toyota Tongaro 5FBE 18 category B1 counterbalance with a lifting capacity of 1,656 kilos. Just got to remember you need to carry out these checks whenever you start your shift or take over from another operator. So first things first, we can check our fork arms. Obviously, they're going to be carrying our weight, so we need to make sure there's no structural damage to those. Have a look at the fork arms, looking for any cracks or splits in there, specifically checking the fork tips. Both tips should be the same shape and there should be no damage there. And at the fork heels, there's also no cracks or damage there. Working your way up the back of the heels, you'll see the fork locating pins which locate into the carriage plate. Got to make sure that they're not missing, that they're not damaged, and that any welds at the rear of the fork heels are all in place as well with no damage there either. Forks are held onto the carriage plate, so we need to make sure the carriage plate's in good condition. That's the top piece of metal on the bottom. Just make sure it's lightly greased and that any carcellation on there for locating the forks isn't rounded off. It's nicely cut, and any bolts in place there are nice and secure. We don't want the forks jumping off the carriage plate. If your truck's fitted with a side shift functionality, you'll notice there's another carriage plate behind it. You've got a little arm at the top hooking over and an arm at the bottom. You need to make sure that both of those are in good condition, and again there's no cracks or splits or damage. And if you've got the side shift, must make sure you check the side shift rams, those are the shiny bits, for any leaks, and the cylinder as well. Moving on to the mast, have a look inside the mast for any debris that might be there getting in the way, and have a look at those rollers just to make sure there's no damage to the roller. And externally on the mast, you're looking for any evidence of impact or any damage there. Down the centre, you'll see the hydraulics for the main lift cylinders. Make sure there's no leaks on there or on the ground if it's been parked overnight. And the chains and hoses running down the mast should be in position and not likely to impede. And again, no debris in the track. You can see the track there. If you look at the back of the main lift cylinders, you'll see 2 hoses there. Those hoses don't actually carry any pressure. They are hydraulic return hoses. So that's where the hydraulic fluid's coming out the cylinder, going back to the tank. Make sure there's no leaks in there though, because where the fluid's coming out, you don't want any hot hydraulic fluid coming back into the operator's position. Checking the lift chains inside the mast, need to make sure that they're in good condition. No pins are sticking out either side. Should be lightly greased with no links missing there either. If you follow the chains up to the top, you'll notice they go over the top of the chain pulleys. So chain pulleys need to be in place with any circlips holding them in position. Circlips not missing, no damage there, and the chains nice and central, sat nice and square on the pulleys. You'll notice there are 2 nuts the other side as the chains go over to make sure they're secure. Just make sure they haven't loosened off at all. As you can see there, the hydraulic hoses and chain going up and down through the pulley, there's no damage there, and that they're not impeding any other function. With hydraulic rams and cylinders, very similar checks on there. This one is the tilt hydraulic ram and tilt cylinder. The ram's the shiny bit and the cylinder behind it. First things first, make sure the ram is attached where it should be and the cylinder is attached where it should be. Any rams should be 3 things: clean, dry and shiny. They certainly shouldn't have any hydraulic fluid leaking out of that cylinder seal there. If it does, that's something to report. Okay, just make sure they're nice and clean. Okay, moving on to wheels and tyres. As you can see, we need to be checking the wheel nuts there. You can either check that with a torque wrench or just tap them with a spanner, and they'll be making a different sound if they're loose. Making sure that we've got adequate tread on there, there's no chunks missing. This tyre here is a solid rubber tyre with quite a low wear line, but you'd need to identify where the wear line is on your particular truck. If it's pneumatic tyres, don't forget they're going to need adequate air pressure. Tyres at the rear, you'll notice there that you can't actually see a great deal of the tyres there. So what you can do is to mount the truck and turn the tyres around one side, and you get a very clear view of what's on that side. Turn them around to the other side, and you get a very clear view of what's around on the other side as well. When the tyres are turned, you'll notice from the photo that you do get quite a large picture of what's there. When they are nice and straight, just also make sure there's nothing caught up between the two of them. External condition and counterweight, need to be making sure there's no damage to the truck. Obviously, we've got panels down the side there to prevent dust or even fingers from getting in the working parts there. Make sure they're in place and that no part of your counterweight is missing or broken off. Obviously, that would reduce your lifting capacity. Check the overhead guard, the rollover protective structure and the falling object protective structure, looking for any obvious signs of damage there. You can see where the overhead guard comes down and joins with the truck. You've got a little green arrow and a circle there. You need to be checking any welds there or any bolts that are holding that in place. Obviously, should an emergency arise while we're operating the truck that is a tip over or something falling on top of the truck, that's going to be the protective structure that's potentially going to save our lives. So we need to make sure that any welds and bolts are all in a good, strong position there should that happen. Operator's position and operator's seat. Obviously, you want to be comfortable. So first thing to do is check the seat, make sure it's in good condition, that it's securely attached, it's not going to be coming off. Checking the seat belt, the shackle and the belt. Check the stitching on the belt to make sure there's no damage. And when you draw the belt all the way out, you're making sure there's no sign of acid on there or any corrosion or any damage that would weaken it. Also, make sure that the seat belt will not release unless you push the button. The last thing you want is a weak shackle. Checking the fluid levels and the battery compartment is a nice regular charge. So at the front on the dashboard on this truck, we've got the brake fluid there. If you pop open the rubber cap, you'll have the brake fluid. Make sure you've got enough in there, and particularly for brake fluid, that there's no debris or any dust or stuff in there. Open up the cap, we've got 24 cells in circuit there. You just want to make sure the cells are good, that there's no damage there, and the water level should just be to the top of the plates. There should be no corrosion on the outside of the cells. Make sure we remember to close the cells before we operate. Remember, appropriate PPE is acid-resistant gloves, goggles, and an apron. Check any battery connectors and sockets there. Make sure that the battery plug is all in place and secure. Any cables there are in the housing properly, not exposed at all. And that when it is plugged in, the cables are sat in a position where they're not going to be cut or interfered with by anything else. Behind the cells on this truck, we've got the hydraulic fluid filler. If we open up the cap there, we can take out the dipstick. You'll notice that the fluid level here is around about the 60 mark. If we stick a black line where the fluid is just there, in a second we'll stick a line where the maximum is. You'll notice a difference there. Don't worry too much about that. That's because the hydraulic fluid that would fill that gap is currently out inside the rams. We are fully tilted forward. If we were to tilt back, obviously the fluid would return and that level would rise. When you close the cap, make sure that the cables are not sat in that position, which would cut them. Make sure they are within the appropriate grooves or housing to make sure they're not going to be damaged at all. Required markings. First things first, really important, check our rated capacity plate. As you can see, this truck is rated at 1,656 kilos at a 500mm load centre. Important to stress, you must be familiar with your own rated capacity before you start operating so you know what you can lift. Check the thorough examination date on the truck. Trucks require a thorough examination every 12 months unless they're fitted or using attachments, used for more than 40 hours a week, or lifting people, in which case the thorough examination goes down to 6 monthly. In case we're operating during the night time or dark conditions, need to be checking the lights. Nice easy checks on there. Just switch the lights on, make sure the bulbs are working, and any brake lights or indicators as well. And also make sure that when we switch on the lights, that any dashboard lights illuminate so that we'd be able to see any warnings or anything we might have to see on the truck. Don't forget to check your overhead amber beacon, either flasher or a rotator. Just make sure there's no damage there and it's working. With audible warnings on this truck, nice easy checks on there as well. Just give a little toot on the horn so you're happy that the horn's working to blind corners and warnings to others. And if you flip the truck into reverse, you should hear the buzzer as well. On this truck, we have a seat pressure switch, so you can hear the truck buzzing there, beeping away to warn us that there's nobody on the truck and it's switched on. Check that's working. And we've also got a micro switch behind the handbrake. So what we'll do is we'll just use a micro switch there, make sure it's working to warn us if we've accidentally removed the handbrake when we shouldn't have done. Hydraulic operation, again, really simple on this one. We're just going to use each one of the hydraulic controls to make sure that they activate the correct motion, that it's nice and smooth, and that none of the levers are sticking. So when we do remove our hand from that, they're not going to keep going or doing anything that's not under control. If you've got side shift, don't forget to check that. You might not use it too often, but it's important to do it. Another thing to mention with the hydraulics checks, obviously the video here shows the mast being tilted. It's important to check the hydraulics to the full extent of what they're capable of doing before you put any weight on the truck. That way you'll have a nice indication of your structural integrity. Just make sure everything's working. You can see from inside the mast here, as we're raising up, you can see the chains and the hydraulic hoses going over their rollers. Notice it's a nice smooth movement. It's not being impeded by anything. There's no debris there. When you get to the top of the mast, it's important to stop for a couple of seconds and just leave it there. It shouldn't come down on its own at all. Okay, if it does, that's certainly a dangerous condition and we won't be using the truck. So they should stay exactly where you leave them. When the forks get to eye level, it's important to check the taper. So thin at the front, fat at the back, no damage there. Check the forks for any damage at the bottom of the forks, and also make sure that the tips are at the same height, so neither fork is bent. If we look from another angle, as the carriage plate comes down, where the two circles are there is where the chains are attached to the back of the carriage plate. Really important. That's the only opportunity we really get to check their security, because we can't see them when they're at ground level. So take your chance to check the rear of those chains there as well. Next thing to do is to check our drive and braking. So with the handbrake on, in gear, we can try and move forward and we should feel resistance. The truck should certainly be struggling to move there. When we're driving, we use the service brake just to make sure the truck stops. And in a nice wide area, we can check our steering, make sure we're steering all the way one way and all the way back round the other way, just to make sure, again, it's a nice smooth operation. There's no interference. We certainly shouldn't have any jerky interference on the steering wheel. That way we're confident that all the systems are working as they should.
Okay, so hopefully that's given you a good or a better understanding, should we say, on the typical visual checks that are done during the inspection. Other aspects that have covered in forklift truck safety: always drive responsibly, because you are in control and it's your duty of care to look after the operation of the vehicle that puts yourself and others at risk. There is the issue around leaving keys inside a parked truck. The advice always is to remove the key. It's a bad habit that's developed at Flamco, and we should always take the keys out so we can guarantee that only authorised drivers use the truck. Now, just to finish off, to put it into context, it is, as any health and safety issue, it is another part of the health and safety policy. The policy sets out our key responsibilities and how it does for everyone. The committee look at this in terms of whether it's still fit for purpose and whether things need to be changed or updated. The use of forklift trucks is included within the health and safety policy. So, final point, it's your role in health and safety to use the right tools and equipment for the job, making sure that the tools are in good condition. And that's, excuse me, written into the policy, and it's also the values of Flamco to make sure that's key to it. And therefore, it's our prime reason as to why we should conduct these pre-inspection, pre-use checks. Now, that's the value that we have, and that's the culture that we want to imply for the organisation. That's forgetting the legislation, the need to do it by law. It's more a case of the general duty of care to look after yourself and others. So use equipment that's fit for purpose, and then do the checks that show that it remains fit for purpose. So the second one there is to report any defects in equipment and ensure that guards are in place at all times. So that goes back to the employee's duty under Section 8 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. Let us know if something's wrong so we can do something about it, but also don't interfere with anything that's provided in the interest of health and safety. Thirdly, use safety equipment and PPE, personal protective equipment, provided, so there's less, excuse me, less impact onto individuals and others. Fourth, ensure a safe working environment for all by maintaining good housekeeping standards. Pieces of pallet falling onto the floor, as an example, pick them up so it doesn't become something the forklift truck drives over and causes the potential for destabilizing of loads. Report any accidents or industrial disease and ensure an entry is made in the accident book. It's a requirement by the policy. It's also a requirement under law. And then finally, set a good example with regard to health and safety standards. Right, so thank you for your time on this session. I hope this will help to gain understanding on the purpose of pre-use checks, and I hope that your use of forklift trucks remains safe whilst on site. Thank you.